Welcome to the One in the Many. My name is Arshak Ben-Lian. My purpose with the One in the Many podcast is to explore the process of integration as developmentally formative and therapeutically corrective factor in human psychology. The One in the Many is the study of how conscious life differentiates identity, integrates relation, regulates itself under constraint, and sustains direction through time. Subscribe to the One in the Many podcast and connect with me by writing to abenlian@oneinthemany.net. Human understanding begins by moving outward. We encounter a field of particulars, distinguish objects within it, observe their actions, compare their similarities and differences, and gradually identify relationships that recur across changing circumstances. This outward movement gives cognition its range. It permits the mind to move beyond isolated perception and discover forms of order that no single concrete could reveal by itself. Yet the expansion of knowledge creates a problem of its own. As observations multiply and relationships become more complex, the mind must determine what within them is essential, what is accidental, what is derivative, and what can be carried into a new context without requiring the entire field to be reconstructed from the beginning. The integrative process, therefore, cannot consist of expansion alone. A mind that only accumulates and connects eventually becomes burdened by the complexity it has generated. Every successful expansion requires a return, a movement from the enlarged field back toward the principle that explains why its elements belong together. This movement is reduction. Reduction does not negate complexity or discard the particulars from which understanding arose. It concentrates their meaning by identifying the smallest sufficient structure capable of preserving the causal and conceptual order of the whole. Within the IIR cycle, induction, integration, and reduction. Reduction is indispensable because it determines whether the preceding movements have actually succeeded. Induction gathers evidence and discovers recurrence. Integration brings differentiated instances into a coherent relation. Reduction tests whether that coherence can be traced to reality, expressed as an essential principle, retained across time, and reapplied under altered conditions. Induction opens the field. Integration organizes it. Reduction determines what the organization means and whether it deserves to direct future cognition and action. The epistemological foundation of this account owes a direct debt to Ayn Rand. In Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, Rand identified concept formation as a process in which differentiated perceptual units are integrated according to their distinguishing characteristics, while their particular measurements are omitted. The resulting concept is not merely a collection of remembered instances. It is a new mental integration that allows an unlimited number of concretes to be retained and used as a single cognitive unit. Rand thereby identified the extraordinary economy made possible when multiplicity is reduced, not by dissolving distinctions, but by retaining the essential relationship that makes the unit commensurable. Rand also emphasized that higher abstractions must remain reducible to perceptual reality. An abstraction cannot be permitted to float free from the observations, subordinate concepts, and causal relationships that give it meaning. To reduce a complex concept is to retrace the hierarchy upon which it depends until one reaches the concrete facts from which the conceptual structure was formed. Reduction in this sense performs two functions simultaneously. It compresses knowledge into usable units, and it preserves the evidential path by which those units remain anchored to reality. The IIR cycle extends this insight by identifying reduction as a distinct movement within the recurring development of cognition. Rand explained how concepts reduce an open-ended range of concrete to manageable units and how abstractions must remain connected to their perceptual foundations. The IIR cycle proposes that every developed integration must undergo a reductive return through its own structure. The achieved whole must be traced backward toward the differentiated conditions that produced it. Through this return, essential relations are strengthened, accidental associations are discarded, contradictions are exposed, and the completed integration becomes available as the starting unit of a new cycle. The significance of reduction can first be observed in a child learning to walk. The child does not begin with an abstract rule of balance. He encounters gravity, muscular tension, shifting weight, changing surfaces, spatial distance, instability, and the consequences of falling. Each attempt supplies another concrete instance. Through repeated action, the child inductively accumulates bodily information. Gradually, these separate sensations and adjustments become integrated into a coordinated pattern of movement. Yet mastery does not consist in consciously remembering every successful step. The child must reduce hundreds of attempts to a compact motor organization. Stabilize the center, place the foot, transfer the weight, recover balance, and continue forward. What began as a field of uncertain particulars becomes a dependable unit of action. The child can now cross surfaces he has never encountered because he does not need to reproduce the precise circumstances under which walking was learned. He carries forward a reduced structure of balance and locomotion. Reduction has transformed experience into skill. The same movement appears in a mature relationship. Two people do not understand one another through a single interaction. They accumulate observations of tone, consistency, vulnerability, conflict, affection, withdrawal, reliability, and repair. Through induction, each begins to recognize patterns in the other. Through integration, these patterns are organized into a more coherent understanding of the person and the relationship. Yet the relationship cannot remain healthy if every new disagreement requires the partners to reconstruct their entire history from the beginning. They must reduce their shared experience to principles capable of guiding present action. They may discover that criticism can be received only after mutual regard has been reaffirmed, that silence sometimes expresses reflection rather than rejection, or that conflict becomes destructive when inferred intention replaces observed behavior. Such principles do not erase the particular experiences from which they arose. They preserve their essential meaning in a form that can regulate future interaction. Trust itself is a reductive achievement. Trust is not the simultaneous recollection of every reliable act separately considered. It is the integration and reduction of repeated reliability into an expectation that can orient action before the next proof is available. Without this reduction, intimacy would remain trapped in immediate evidence. Each new moment would begin at zero. Reduction allows accumulated relational experience to become a durable premise. The third manifestation appears in scientific and productive achievement. A scientist may observe hundreds of cases, record numerous measurements, compare competing explanations, and integrate apparently unrelated phenomena into a common model. Yet the work remains incomplete until the model can be reduced to a principle that explains more than the original observations. A business may perform thousands of transactions, respond to changing customer needs, refine its production methods, and coordinate many specialized functions. Yet it cannot reproduce or scale its success unless it reduces this accumulated activity to standards of judgment and repeatable processes. A productive principle is a form of compressed causality. It preserves the relationship between conditions and outcomes while omitting details that do not determine the result. A successful reduction does not merely describe what happened. It identifies what must be retained for the result to recur. In science, this becomes a law, theory, or explanatory model. In business, it becomes a process, strategy, or operating principle. In individual action, it becomes skill. Across all three contexts, reduction converts a past integration into a future capacity. The historical development of knowledge repeatedly exhibits this movement. Aristotle confronted a vast range of natural and human phenomena and reduced explanatory inquiry to distinct kind of causes. His achievement did not consist merely in cataloging objects, but in identifying the recurrent questions through which objects and processes could be understood. Newton brought terrestrial falling and celestial motion under a common explanatory structure. The apparent multiplicity of motions was reduced to principles that could be applied beyond the observations from which they were derived. Darwin integrated evidence from variation, inheritance, adaptation, geology, and the distribution of species into a developmental explanation of biological form. Montessori, through disciplined observation of children, reduced a wide variety of behaviors to principles concerning independence, ordered activity, sensitive periods, and the formative role of the prepared environment. Rand reduced the immense complexity of conceptual cognition to the integration of perceptual concretes through essential similarity and measurement omission. These achievements differ profoundly in content, but their cognitive form is related. Each begins with a field too differentiated to be understood as an unorganized collection. Each discovers relations among its elements. Each then expresses those relations through a more economical structure capable of preserving the explanatory power of the whole. The final principle does not explicitly contain every observation. It contains the order by which the observations can be understood. Reduction can therefore be identified as the criterion by which integration reveals its validity. An apparent integration may connect many facts, but unless it can be reduced to an essential relation, its coherence remains uncertain. It may be no more than an association, an aesthetic resemblance, a rhetorical synthesis, or an arrangement imposed upon the material. Reduction forces the integrated whole to disclose its organizing necessity. This is why reduction resembles the act of checking one's premises, as Ayn Rand used to say. To reduce an integration is to travel backwards through its structure and ask what each element contributes, which relations are causal, which distinctions are necessary, and where an unsupported assumption may have entered. If removing a proposition causes the explanation to collapse, that proposition may be essential. If removing it changes nothing, it may be redundant or ornamental. If the integration cannot be traced to its foundations without contradiction, the mind must return to the field and reconsider its induction. Reduction thus performs both a constructive and corrective function. Constructively, it transforms complex understanding into a portable unit. Correctively, it exposes misintegration. A misintegration often persists because its contradictory elements remain distributed across a large conceptual field. Once the field is reduced to its governing premises, the contradiction becomes visible. Reduction concentrates the logic of the structure until its coherence or incoherence can no longer remain concealed. In 2008, during an independent study of neuroscience, I identified a striking structural correspondence between this epistemological process and the backpropagation of an action potential within the neuron. This observation introduced a physiological analog for the reductive return. The possibility that the result of a neuronal integration travels backward into the differentiated field that contributed to its formation, modifying that field in preparation for future activity. The correspondence must be treated as a structural analogy rather than a literal identity. A neuron does not form concepts, examine premises, or validate truth. Nevertheless, the organization of neuronal activity displays a recursive pattern that illuminates the logic of the IIR cycle. Many neurons, particularly cortical pyramidal neurons, possess extensive dendritic trees across which thousands of synaptic inputs may arrive. These signals differ in strength, timing, location, and whether their effects are excitatory or inhibitory. They travel through the dendritic structure toward the soma, where their combined influence contributes to the neuron's total state. If the integrated activity reaches the threshold required at the axon initial segment, the neuron generates an action potential. The structural direction resembles induction and integration. Distributed inputs converge from a differentiated field. Their effects are combined, inhibited, reinforced, delayed, and transformed. If the integrated state crosses a threshold, the neuron produces a unified output. Conceptually, the movement is similar. Many concretes are observed. Their differences and similarities are compared. Relevant relationships are integrated. A concept, judgment, or principle is formed. The parallel can be stated as many inputs become an integrated neuronal determination. Many concretes become an integrated conceptual unit. The action potential is not itself a concept, but it represents a cellular determination. The differentiated activity distributed across the neuron has produced a unitary response. The analogy becomes especially significant because the action potential does not travel only forward along the axon. In many neurons, it also propagates backward from the soma into the portions of the dendritic tree. This back-propagating action potential returns toward the very field within which the contributing synaptic signals were received and integrated. The completed neuronal output, therefore, returns electrically toward its differentiated conditions of formation. This resembles conceptual reduction, in which the mind begins with an achieved abstraction or conclusion and retraces the structure from within it arose. What concrete does this concept subsume? What similarities made their integration possible? What subordinate concepts does this higher abstraction require? Which observations and premises justify the conclusion? What perceptual facts ultimately anchor the hierarchy? The deepest similarity is not simply that both movements proceed backwards. It is that an achieved unity returns to the differentiated conditions that produced it. The analogy becomes still more precise when the returning action potential reaches synapses that were recently active. The back-propagating spike does not automatically produce the same effect at every synapse. Its consequences depend upon timing, dendritic location, local depolarization, calcium dynamics, neuromodulation, and the recent activity of the synapse. Under appropriate conditions, the coincidence between synaptic input and postsynaptic firing can contribute to the strengthening or weakening of the connection. In simplified structural terms, the neuron is registering that a particular input was active in temporal relation to the integrated output. This resembles a primitive form of credit assignment. The neuron has fired, but which synaptic events participated in producing that firing? The integration between the returning action potential and traces of recent synaptic activity helps modify the connections implicated in the event. Conceptual reduction performs a more developed and conscious form of credit assignment. It asks which observations, distinctions, premises, and subordinate integrations earned the higher conclusion. It distinguishes constitutive evidence from accidental association. Suppose a person reaches the judgment that trust depends upon demonstrated reliability across time. Reduction traces that conclusion backwards. Particular promises were made. Some were fulfilled and some were not. Fulfillment recurred across changing circumstances. The recurrence distinguished reliable conduct from accidental success. The abstraction of trustworthiness was formed from this pattern. The reductive return identifies which concretes earned the conclusion. It can also reveal whether emotionally charged but irrelevant experiences were included, whether contradictory instances were evaded, or whether the conclusion was generalized beyond the available evidence. The parallel may therefore be stated carefully. Neuronal backpropagation returns the integrated output toward the synaptic field that participated in producing it. Conceptual reduction returns the achieved integration toward the concrete and conceptual field that justifies it. In both processes, the return is selective rather than indiscriminate. The neuroanalogy also reveals why reduction is not merely retrospective. When a backpropagating action potential enters the dendritic tree, it can contribute to calcium signals and synaptic plasticity. The returning event may alter the efficacy of the very connections that will participate in future neuronal integrations. The output does not merely report that integration occurred. Under appropriate conditions, it reorganizes the architecture of future responsiveness. Conceptual reduction has the same recursive function at the epistemological level. When a conclusion is traced to its supporting concretes, the mind may discover that some premises deserve strengthening, some distinctions require refinement, some associations were accidental, some concepts were too broad, and some evidence was omitted. The reduction can confirm the integration, modify it, and force its abandonment. In both cases, the return changes the conditions of the next forward movement. The IIR cycle can therefore be mapped structurally onto the neuronal process. Induction corresponds to the reception of differentiated inputs across the dendritic field. Integration corresponds to the coordinated summation and transformation of those inputs into a neuronal determination. Reduction corresponds to the return of the completed output toward the contributing field, where the relations among input, integration, and result may be reinforced or modified. Renewed induction begins from a structure that has been changed by the preceding cycle. This reveals the IIR cycle not as a linear sequence, but as a recursive spiral. Input leads to integration. Integration leads to determination. Determination to return. Return to modification. And modification to new input. The neuron receives the world through a structure partly shaped by its previous activity. The mind approaches new concretes through concepts partly shaped by its previous reductions. Each completed cycle establishes conditions for the next. The limits of the analogy must remain clear. A back-propagating action potential does not determine whether the neuron's output corresponds to reality, whether a belief is true, or whether an action is morally justified. Its plastic effects depend upon broader circuitry, inhibitory regulation, neuromodulatory conditions, behavioral consequences, and the state of the organism. Conceptual reduction, by contrast, is an epistemological operation. It can be consciously directed toward the validation of knowledge by tracing abstractions to evidence and checking the logical relation among premises. A full biological analog of conceptual reduction would therefore require more than the backpropagating spike alone. It would include recurrent activation across neuronal networks, memory reactivation, error and reward signals, synaptic eligibility traces, inhibitory correction, and the organism's ongoing interaction with reality. The backpropagating action potential, nevertheless, captures a decisive component: the backward communication of an achieved integration toward the differentiated sources that contributed to it. This physiological correspondence gives deeper meaning to the IIR cycle. Induction carries differentiated particulars toward integration. Integration produces a unified determination. Reduction carries that determination backward toward its conditions of formation, validating or reorganizing them so that the next induction begins from a more developed structure. The process appears in the child who reduces repeated attempts to a motor skill and can therefore explore a wider environment. It appears in a relationship that reduces accumulated experience to principles of trust and can therefore confront greater vulnerability. It appears in science when observations are reduced to a law that directs the search for previously unknown phenomena. It appears in productive activity when complex experience is reduced to a method capable of being reproduced under new conditions. At the neuronal level, it appears structurally when an integrated firing event returns to the dendritic field and contributes to the modification of future responsiveness. Reduction thus increases the radius of action. It releases attention from the need to preserve every detail consciously and makes cognitive energy available for new differentiation. The mind does not become less responsive to concretes by reducing them. It becomes more capable of perceiving the significance of new concrete because it now possesses a stable unit of comparison and orientation. The full movement of the IIR cycle can therefore be stated more precisely. Induction expands the range of evidence. Integration discovers the organization of that evidence. Reduction identifies, tests, and preserves the essential relation by which the organization can be connected to reality and projected into new action. Induction supplies the many. Integration discovers their unity. Reduction returns that unity to its foundations and transforms it into a new one capable of entering another field of many. Reduction is indispensable because without it, integration remains bound to the context in which it first occurred. It may be experienced as an insight, but it cannot yet function as validated and transferable knowledge. Reduction extracts the governing relation from the completed integration, tests its dependence upon reality, and gives it sufficient independence from its original circumstances to guide a new investigation. The presentation of reduction has therefore brought us through the very cycle it describes. We began with the expanding field of human knowledge and the problem produced by accumulated complexity. We selected reduction as the direction through which the completion of integration could be examined. The child's acquisition of motor skill revealed reduction transforming repeated experience into capacity. The mature relationship revealed it transforming a relational history into trust and guidance. Scientific and productive achievement revealed it transforming integrated complexity into transferable causal knowledge. The historical sequence showed that intellectual advancement repeatedly depends upon the reduction of an enlarged field to an economical explanatory structure. Rand's epistemology clarified how concepts integrate concrete into cognitive units and how abstractions must remain reducible to perceptual foundations. The neuronal analogy I identified in 2008 revealed a physiological pattern of recursive return. The completed integration moving backward toward the field that contributed to its formation, modifying that field in preparation for future activity. From these developments, reduction emerges as the test of integration, the means of detecting misintegration, the preservation of acquired knowledge, the allocation of causal credit, and the bridge from one cycle of inquiry to another. The listener can apply this process to any field in which an unrealized integration may remain dormant. He can begin by identifying the observations that have accumulated without yet acquiring order. He can seek the relationships that make those observations intelligible. He can then reduce the resulting integration to the smallest sufficient principle that preserves its causal meaning and remains traceable to reality. Where such a reduction cannot yet be completed, the inquiry remains unfinished. The induction may be insufficient. The integration may be unstable. An essential distinction may be missing, or a contradiction may have been concealed. Where reduction succeeds, complexity becomes newly available to thought. What was previously overwhelming becomes a principle of orientation. What was discovered once can be recognized again. What was integrated in one context becomes a source of power in another. Reduction is therefore not the diminishment of knowledge, it is the concentration of knowledge into generative power. It completes the integrative cycle by returning the achieved unity to its foundations, reorganizing those foundations, and preparing consciousness for a wider field of differentiation. Reduction closes the cycle only by awakening the next.
This is the one in the many. The principle of life is the process of integration from a single cell to an ideal human being. The story of life unfolds through integration, from a single percept to a library of knowledge. Through virtue, reason, honesty, independence, selfishness, productivity, you set your values, purpose, to achieve self-esteem and happiness. Through time and energy, from induction to integration to reduction, the smallest particle unifies matter, and the highest purpose unifies your life. You, the one in the many, matter. May you integrate your life with value-driven days.